Well, hello, everybody. Here we are on the Three Consulting Amigos. It's another Friday, and today we're going to touch on something that is really important since only about 20% of all businesses ever sell. So, how do you go about doing that? And today, Ed's going to walk us through the way in which you can sell your small business. So, with that, Ed, help us understand how we can overcome this huge barrier.
Well, as you know, this is an exciting topic to me. I've been really involved with this over the last 5 years. I get listings sent to me every day. I'm always analyzing opportunities. And today we're going to be talking about, selling a small business, but really the same thing applies to buying a small business. And unfortunately, with a small business, if you own one, you can't run down to the stock market or your local bank and cash in your business. And that's what really makes it hard selling and buying a small business because there's really no market for it. And so you have to spend a lot of time trying to find someone who wants to buy it. And as we'll find out here, there isn't really a real established marketplace for finding these types of businesses. So I thought I'd start the presentation out by talking a little bit about the profile of a small business. It's I've always thought of small business being something around $5 million worth of revenue. Actually, as Ron has indicated many times, it's more of a Main Street business. These guys are anywhere from maybe $750,000 in revenue to maybe 2 million. And a lot of times they don't have the management team to support it. And it's privately owned, and it's hard to sell. There's no established marketplace, and there's limited financial information, mainly tax returns, and the information isn't audited or reviewed. So you really don't know how accurate it is. And the owner's goals are basically they're using this business to make a living. They like working for themselves. And obviously, we all know they all want to minimize tax. They'll spend lots of money to come up with strategies to minimize their taxes, even though a lot of times they're just timing differences.
Well, and
And
if I can add a note to that, Ed, because I know you're going to address it. But they minimize their taxes and then they want to maximize their return. And of course, people who are interested in the business are asking, why is there such a 50% difference between one and the other?
yeah, that's true. But I think a good financial person can help them understand that reconciliation so that they're dealing with real dollars. But one of the problems I see is I think tax rates are going up, not down. So by paying less tax now and paying more tax down the road, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. But most people are still thinking that it's best to prolong and defer taxes. So that's a side note and a whole nother program. And bottom line is that, and this gets into your comment number 6, Ray, and that is when you value these businesses, you're kind of looking at owner's discretionary earnings or cash flow, which starts with the cash flow from the business. And then you add back like special items like car allowances. And then there's a lot of personal expenses sometimes that flow through the business that you have to add back. So when you look at a small business, you're trying to figure out what's the true cash flow that it's bringing in before taxes. So how do you locate a small business? Well, there's a couple online marketplaces. I'm not sure. I've been dabbling in these and trying to get information. And quite frankly, they sell businesses throughout the country. And I'm not interested in buying a business in New York. So you have to somehow bring it down into your area that you're interested in. And there's 2 of them, bizbuysell.com and bizquest.com. And business brokers, Ray said he was a business broker at one point in time in his career. They're really kind of like the key people in this marketplace. And which is kind of interesting because business brokers have to have a real estate license. They have to be a real estate broker, but selling a business is not like selling a piece of property. So that's another challenge, and it kind of limits the number of people that can become business brokers. There's a couple organizations out there, International Business Broker Association and California Association of Business Brokers. These are organizations that you can dial into and try to get information on businesses for sale. And the tough part, though, there's a lot of, they say of the next 10 years, most 60% or 70% of the businesses are planning on selling. But it's really hard to find out who really wants to sell their business or not, because business owners are so busy doing their jobs, they don't have any time to really think about that. So there's a lot of businesses that are available out there that you just don't know about, and they could be good deals for the seller and the buyer.
Yeah, and there's so many of them, Ed, that either like Ron and I, who are single employees, or in his case, he had employees but just chose not to sell. So there's always the factor of, and I think you and I talked at one point, you had a business that was turning $2 million and the guy didn't want to sell. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I've run into several businesses that were making quite a bit of money, and they just weren't interested on selling. They didn't have any offsprings to give the business to. They just shut them down.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, but that's what's going on. So anyway, some of the reasons, or you got to find out what business is right for you. And so here's some of the questions you got to think about. Is it a job that you're buying, or is it a real business with a return for shareholders? That's a big question. We've talked about that before.
And yeah, and is there a management team, or can you build a management team for it?
Absolutely. And do you have the skills and interest to run the business that you're looking at buying, and can you add value? The worst thing that is imaginable is you spend a lot of money buying a business and then you find out you don't like it. What do you do then? They're not easy to sell. You're probably going to take a haircut and lose some money, and later in life, that's not a good thing.
Or
Yeah,
and you realize you can't run it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And I've actually had clients and prospects in that situation, mostly in the women's dress business, because some woman thought it would be really fun and cool to have a dress shop, and so they would go in really excited, and they would sell. They would buy it and think that they got a good deal because the owner discounted the inventory by 20% and something like that. And of course, it didn't take very long for them to realize that while they wanted to go out and buy stuff that they liked, and they were not professional buyers really, they might have good taste, that what would happen is that their sales would just continually to go down. And that's about the time they called me in. And then I'd say, well, the problem is your inventory is too old, and so you're being bogged down in inventory here. And she said, well, but we got it for a really good price, and so we'll mark it down 20%. Well, okay, so now you're marking it down to what it cost you, but the problem is the consumer only thinks it's worth half of that. And so now you've got to take a huge write down because the inventory is actually trash. Now, not very many not very many people understand, if they haven't been in the rag business, that inventory is like a banana. It turns yellow in just a few days, and so it turns brown. I mean, so you've got to understand that business before you get into it. So then they turn right around and they sell it because they realize it's going to be hard. And what happens? They sell it for half what they bought it for. So it's a disaster all the way around.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've worked together on with some of the businesses we've been involved with collectively, and that is getting business owners to look at opportunities outside their four walls that are complementary to what they do, where they could add extra value, extreme value in some cases, to what they're doing. And unfortunately, most business owners don't have that foresight. Again, they're so focused on their day-to-day business, they can't outside the box.
Yeah. It's too bad.
Yeah, it really is a lost opportunity. It's one of our financial drivers for increasing the value of a business. You got to make sure the business is the right size for you. Is it too big? If it's too big, it could be requiring a lot of hours. And you got to figure that into the cost of buying the business. Do you really want to spend 80 hours a week running a business? Maybe you might want to go a little smaller scale and spend maybe 40 hours a week. Yeah, so you got to look at these kind of things, because after you buy, it's too late.
Yeah.
Of course, the smaller scale you go, depending on the hours and stuff, the more you have to spend. So, I mean, there's some sort of a diminishing return there, where it's so small that you can't really afford to hire anybody, and so now you're at 8 hours.
Yeah.
But they need to really understand how much time and effort it's going to take to do it.
Obviously, go ahead, Ray.
I was just going to say, the other thing that we know is all small business owners, it really does require a commitment of 60 to 80 hours a week. And I think sometimes the buyer doesn't, just assumes that this is going to be a 40-hour-a-week job. And that's a disaster.
Right.
Oh, how about for your spouse?
Yeah.
All of a sudden you buy a business, you're taking money out of the household, you buy a business, and all of a sudden you don't see the spouse.
Or the spouse has to actually help in order to keep the thing afloat.
Yes. Yeah. These things happen, right?
Now they absolutely happen. Absolutely happen.
And that could be a reason for a potential divorce down the road.
I've kind of been there too. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously location's important. One of the things is really important. You got to have the money. You have the appetite to buy it. Do you really have the money? They're not free.
Right.
And it's not only the price of the business, but it's the working capital necessary to run the business, which a lot of times people don't consider.
Right. And I think the point you made, Ed, is time is money. And so when you're used to working 40 hours a week and now you're doing 80, that time can't be used for anything else. It's got to be used to drive the business.
Yes. And then you wonder why the seller is selling the business. But I think now, I mean, a lot of people are selling their business. They're in their 70s. I think, you know why they're selling. They need to get out.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sometimes they don't provide enough runway for them to get out and make some money. And they eventually give the business away for pennies on the dollar or shut it down.
Yeah.
I think really one thing that's really important, especially if you're buying a business that you don't have really in-depth knowledge of, you need the seller's support during a transition to make sure you understand the business. And so that's really important.
I think we both experienced this, Ed, watching a business sell and then, making sure that former owner is committed in some way in the agreement to stay on for 6 to 10 months just to help make the transition for the new owner. Is that similar to your experience?
Yeah, I think that really does help. Unfortunately, sometimes they wait too long to sell and they don't have the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're on their deathbed and they're trying to sell their business. Well, there's not going to be much of a transition there.
Yeah.
And you also got the new owner thinking they know everything at that point, and the old owner trying to say, well, that's not the way I did it. And so they end up hating each other before the situation's over.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
The other thing, can you trust the financial information? You really got to spend a lot of time on the revenue side. You got to focus on the revenue side, not the expense side, but pretty much revenue. Is that revenue going to remain with the business? And I bought a lot of weekly newspapers in my career, and it was amazing how all of a sudden when you bought the paper, the revenue declined. And more than you anticipated. So you really have to do a lot of due diligence on that revenue source and make sure it's not going away. Well, sometimes the owner obviously knows all the warts of the business, and they may know that maybe one or two of their key customers are going to go somewhere else.
Well,
Right. And, you know,
a
that's
lot
the
of them
point.
have personal relationships with their advertisers, and it's a friendly thing,
Right.
especially in the newspaper business. You know, it's awfully difficult to determine whether or not an ad actually ever worked. And
Right.
so a lot of the business is based on personal relationships, not factual responses.
Right. Right. And
That's
then,
very
you
true.
know, one of the things that obviously, Ron, you're really familiar with is a customer concentration. And again, like you said, you know, if this is a personal relationship, when the owner goes, you may have a customer who has 30% of the business decides to move elsewhere.
You bet. You bet. Of course, the old Prado principle, you know, 80/20 applies there. And if the business happens to be in an 80/20 or 90/10 kind of situation where 20% of the customers make up 80% of the business, you're really vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then customers like doing business with somebody, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, people they know and trust. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then all of a sudden, when there's a change, all of a sudden they question, well, maybe I can do business with somebody else rather than this company.
Yeah.
Right.
Or maybe I can just get rid of this advertising bill that I never believed in.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think one of the biggest things, and I think when you're very enamored up front and you think you're going to run this business, don't consider this, but you got to be able to absorb the risks. And it might not turn out the way you envision it to turn out. So you got to be prepared for that, because if you have a surprise risk that hits your family, you might not be able to move on. It could destroy your plans for the future.
Yeah, it could, and I've run into circumstances where, you know, the wife wants to have the dress shop, just to use that same, you know, and it turns out poorly, and they figure, well, they just need to buy new inventory now, and so they mortgage the house, so they end up losing the house along with the business,
Yeah.
and I've been there, I've seen that happen. It's a very sad circumstance when that happens, and it's because the buyer is ignorant about what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, here's another thing. If you're up in age and you want to buy a business, you got to be careful, because if something happens to you, what's your wife going to do? Your spouse going to do with that business? You have no clue what this business is all about. And as we talked about, it's a challenge selling a business. It's a challenge selling a business when the owner is actively involved in selling it. If the owner is not there, it becomes extremely difficult to sell. And a lot of those just don't make it. So you explore, if you're interested in a business, you start exploring listings by broker. And there's a lot of business brokers out there. And if you find one, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which means you can't tell anybody else, which kind of inhibits you a little bit, because you like to bring other people in and get their viewpoint, but you got to be careful. So that means everybody's got to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and not everybody wants to do that. It's just kind of like a hassle. But when you get to that point, you want to schedule a visit with the owner. You want to talk to the person actually selling the business and running the business, rather than trying to do all your correspondence through a broker. And then you find out if it's the right size for you and you understand the business. I think understanding the business is more important than understanding all the financials, because you have to keep running that business, making sure it is going to survive and prosper. It gets right back into some of the things we've talked about in previous programs, the market. I really don't think there's anything more important than the market and the customers that you're serving, right?
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, that's right. And so I agree with you. Knowing the business is a huge opportunity, and therefore, perhaps somebody already has a business, similar business, really is the potential buyer, and you as a business owner may be the potential buyer. So, if you know the customers, the customer base, then you've got an opportunity to take that new business and mold it into something that kind of works with the rest of your business. So there's a huge advantage in just knowing the market, knowing the customers as well. Yeah.
I really can't think of anything more important than that, because if someone steals your customers, you no longer have a business.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other thing that happened, I think we took a look at, I believe it was a lamp company, which is a good example. Everything about the company looked really good, but they were making lamps that were out of style. Remember that? It was upstate somewhere, and in looking at that, it became pretty apparent to me that the pipes, the old interesting rough gas pipe lamps, were really fun and neat, and they really kind of worked with that rustic look and so forth. But that's all switched in a matter of about 3 or 4 or 5 years. That switched because the younger customer really wants what they call mid-century, which is really sort of contemporary plastic and chrome, modern, straight lines, etc. And so, what he had been doing successfully for, I think he had a real good 10-year run. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not he's going to be successful in the future, because that's the fashion business.
Right.
Somebody needs to know the lamp business and the lamp buying community in order to be able to do something with that particular business.
Yeah.
If I can draw some analogy to that, Ron, I did have a lighting company that I was working with in LA, and they were in a position where the owner was my age, and he had a son, but the son really didn't seem to be committed to the business as he should have been, and they were in the process of a transition. We were moving from fluorescents to LEDs, and so you had a combination of impacts. The owner leaving, the industry changing, the son not sure. It was a major issue for the sale. So, and I think, Ed, you've talked about several of your own personal experiences.
Yeah, it's scary. You put a lot of money down on a business, and then you find all these surprises afterwards. And I remember when the three of us were looking at a window business. And I think that window business actually did pretty well, but man, it's up against some big players.
Yeah.
And if you screw up a window job and have to replace everything, that's a big risk.
Right.
So, I mean, it's really hard to buy a business without the experience of running that business. You have the risks become profound, and it's really difficult to overcome that. So then you rely upon one of your employees, which gets into another issue. If the employee leaves, what do you do then?
Oh,
the employee knows he's got you cornered, so to speak, that he can get whatever he wants or she wants because of negotiating with you, because they know you need them.
Right. And you're, in this case, Ed, you're talking about the new owner. What does the employee have to do with this new owner that they don't know?
Yeah. So, one of the things I like to think about is maybe owning smaller businesses that are producing good cash flow, that don't require a lot of time and effort. The cash flow is smaller, but you can have several businesses going on at the same time. So that's just another, instead of buying a real big business, maybe you buy several really small businesses that you can help manage and also have a life outside of work.
Well, I have yet to see somebody do that. So, I think that's a very interesting, hopeful, wishful kind of thing that, and I have known people who have built, say, an online business, and they still have their regular job. or they're doing something pretty interesting, and they're making pretty good cash flow because they have a very special talent. Where MicroGIants is working with a guy right now who's developed an unbelievable game. And the target, to talk about a niche market, the target is Christian youth, from 13 to 22. And it has to do with Bible verses and good and evil. It's a board game. The graphics are spectacular because he's a graphic artist. And it's a fun thing, and it fits into this very narrow genre of board game playing, and therefore he's hoping that this is going to work for him. Well, I can tell you without a doubt that there's not one in maybe a million that had the capacity, the intellect, and the ability to develop a game like that. So there is no value to that. He could sell the future cash flow to the game once it becomes a hit. That might work. So where you're owning a property and you found some other way to continue to sell and distribute it. But I mean, he's out going to youth groups in person, and he knows the game. Wow. So this is, while the opportunity is incredible, and Ray, I know you'd be very interested in this, but the opportunity to buy it is almost nil, because he's the only one that will have what it takes in order to be able to finish the creation and get it produced and all that kind of stuff. And then he's moving on to the next one, which are children's books that tie into the game. Oh. So he's got this unbelievable vision. It's the kind of thing that can be a disruptor. It's like, who's going to come in now? He needs help running a business. That's why we're working with him. He needs help. He doesn't know business, and hopefully we'll be able to really help him a lot there. But that's the kind of a business where he could make pretty good money and not work really hard once he gets the sales engine going. And maybe you could sell that to somebody else, and it wouldn't be hard to do once it was all done. But in terms of keeping the business going, boy, pretty tough to do just from anybody off the street.
Yeah. I mean, this is an example. It's what if you can get the sales going, it could work. But it's getting the sales going that's the hardest part.
Yeah, well, you can also be selling things that you're not making profit on. So the more you sell, the more you lose.
Right.
It's complicated, as Ronan indicated.
Why don't we just sell more?
Yeah, we'll sell more. We'll make it up with volume. But you do an analysis to determine whether the business is right for you. And yeah, I would focus more on the business rather than the financial statements. A lot of people will focus on line items. So, your entertainment's up 10%. It really, that's not the key. You got to be able to focus on your customers and the market you're serving.
Right.
Which gets into the point, top line over bottom line. And most people feel more comfortable on the bottom line than they do the top line. That's why you need guys like Ron around to help on that top line. Top line is really the key. Mm-hmm. And whether you can add value to the business, that's a really important aspect of this whole decision. And if you identify a partner or two that you got a good working relationship, they could add further value. As we just indicated with Ray's comment, these running businesses are complicated, and having different expertise involved really does help. And then you need a plan to do how you're going to operate the business after you buy it. You don't develop the plan. You got to have some type of a vision and plan before you buy it. And I wouldn't be wasting a lot of time on businesses that aren't making 10 to 15% incremental profit margin, because who wants to pick up all the headaches of somebody else, pay money for it, and not make any money in return?
And I would, along with that, Ed, I would also say there has to be an enormous potential upside to the revenue line, because normally you buy the business based on, the numbers that you're looking at and what the perceived value is and so forth. But for the most part, you're buying that business. In order to make a lot of money, you have to buy the future business, the one that you're going to turn it into. That's where you really amplify the purchase, which I think you have to kind of hope happens in order to be able to mitigate these enormous risks which we have talked about. So you do need a vision for where the business revenue is going to come from, before you really sign on the dotted line.
Yeah.
I think it's good to have some type of a benchmark when you're looking at these businesses as to what's a fair price, because when you start looking at businesses, obviously the owner wants a lot more than what it's really truly worth most of the time. So kind of going in some rules of thumb might be helpful to you. And 50 to 60% of gross sales as a price seems to be okay for a Main Street type of business. A sales price of somewhere around $500,000. When you look at it as a multiple of earnings, something like 2 to 2.5 would be an acceptable multiple. Just so you know, professions like CPA professions, engineering companies, a lot of times they go for 1 to 1.25 times revenue is kind of like the common benchmark for them. But the key is to come up with a price that is fair to both. It's like that in everything in life, fair to the buyer and fair to the seller. And it requires a bit of negotiating and talking, and a lot of times face to face, and dealing with the owner really helps rather than going through a third party. So you make an offer, and when you make an offer, you got to make sure you have enough money to cover the price and the working capital. And another rule of thumb would be 1/3 from the buyer as a down payment, 1/3 from a bank or an SBA loan, and 1/3 provided by some type of payment to the seller. Not all sellers are interested in that, but sometimes that's what it takes to get a deal done.
Right.
And consider earnouts. Earnouts, I kind of like earnouts because it keeps the seller involved and make sure that you're continuing to make money. If you don't make money, he doesn't make his money. So it seems to be a nice approach, although sellers don't like it, generally speaking.
Could you explain that further for our viewers so they understand what an earnout is, Ed?
Yeah, an earnout would be, okay, well, I'm going to buy this from you, and I'm going to give you 10% of whatever we earn over the next 3 years off the bottom line as additional payment for the business. That way, you don't pay it unless you make that money, and it obviously it is an incentive for the seller to be involved in helping you run the business, passing along that knowledge. Points to consider: price is important to sellers. They all want the best price. In reality, it should be based upon the net cash flow after taxes, or what goes in their pocket, but they pretty much can look at it as a price type of a situation. They're more focused on the price, whereas the buyer's more focused on the terms and conditions of the deal. They want to make sure that the business is successful and they can make payments down the road rather than paying it all up front.
Ed, can I ask another question that I think popped up from, you mentioned earlier on one of the slides that it should have a 10 to 20% profit. Can you explain to the viewers, what does that mean? Is that 10% or 20% net? What exactly is the profit, and how does that tie into this?
Well, it's basically, what revenue you're bringing in cash flow wise, and what expenses cash flow wise you're paying out that you need to pay out. Obviously, you don't need to continue paying for the seller's Mercedes that he's running through the business. So you can add that to the bottom line. But obviously, I unless you have a complementary business, buying a business that isn't making any money is quite a challenge. And you don't want to spend money on and try to pick up headaches from somebody else that couldn't figure it out.
Right.
Well, I would just throw sort of a complete opposite in there, and that is that there are businesses that have assets that maybe you wouldn't even do the same thing. Like say somebody's got a restaurant and they've got a whole bunch of kitchen equipment and tables and chairs and everything you need to set up, and they haven't found a good seller before, and they haven't been able to get anything close to their price. And so what you do is you go in and you give them 10% of the assets. And so, there's a case where you can, quote, buy a business. You're really buying assets. You might leave them in that location, you might move it, but you can really come out ahead in terms of starting a business on a low budget. If you find something left over like that. And if I were going to go into the restaurant business, I'd probably do it something like that. Keep my eye open, because there are restaurants, especially now, all over the place that you can buy this stuff. And I mean, I have seen the back equipment tables and preparation tables and a variety of things, and they're going for 5% of their original value. So if you need that stuff, there's a good place to go, and you give them a package deal and you say, I'll give you $20,000 for the whole deal, and you're getting $250,000 worth of stuff. I mean, there's a way to start your business.
Well, that brings up another good point. That is, you're always, in my opinion, you're much better buying a business that's already operational than trying to start one from scratch by yourself.
Well, I'm talking again, I guess, about the person who kind of knows what they're doing, and they know the value. You'll have some bidders, in a deal like that. But you could also do exactly the same thing when somebody's ready to close the door and walk away. And that is, you open it up and you put a new sign on and you change the look and feel. And you can, you can do fine if you recognize that you can get some of these things for just a song. And I've known a few people who've done that. Probably the richest guy I ever knew, and happened to be from high school, made his living by buying foreign cars that were scrap for $100 and putting them on a lot and selling them for $10,000 in parts.
Yeah.
There's a business right there. That's a good business.
No,
He's a multi-millionaire with probably 10,000 cars on his lot today.
Right.
I mean, this guy understood. He was a math major. This guy understood that if you buy something for just a few cents on the dollar and you sell it for the whole dollar, or even $1.10 or $1.20, that you don't have to do a lot of business to make a lot of money. Those are opportunities, just like buying an ongoing business based on the standard, the standard ratios.
I would say that you're looking at a liquidation type of a situation there.
Well, when we consider how many businesses don't sell,
right,
the vast majority of them are liquidation.
Absolutely, and there is the market.
Yeah.
If you figure that one out, you're going to be a millionaire or a billionaire, whatever, because there are a lot of opportunities like that just get washed away.
They do. People just sit there and go, wow, I mean, I lost all my money and I couldn't even sell my brand new, because they were new in business, didn't know what they're doing, bought brand new $300,000 worth of kitchen equipment, and now it's worth nothing because everybody's closing up.
That's exactly right. That's a very good point, and it's a great opportunity for somebody who wants to invest in that area.
By the way, talk about the stock market. The restaurant business under that scenario is a lot riskier than the stock market.
It is.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I think we have to reinforce again that 80% of all businesses never sell. They simply close the doors. So that in itself is a shock. When you're buying
a scrap dealer and picking up these opportunities is a real opportunity to grow and add value. Absolutely.
So, to parrot Ray on the other end of the stick, 80% of the new businesses go broke in 5 years.
Yes, yeah.
And the one,
Yes.
half of those never make any money. So now we're down to
Right.
10%. Of the 10% who make money that you might actually be able to sell, 80% of those never sell. So what's that ratio? 1 in 1,000 actually sell who start?
That
Well, I
is
think we've
almost
convinced all of
impossible.
our viewers that buying a business is may not be the thing for their future.
Well, we've certainly talked about all the reasons not to buy one, and perhaps that's part of the problem. Is you can't. Nobody wants to buy a business because they're scared to death, and nobody can sell their business because everybody's scared to death of all of the things that we've brought up today.
Right.
It's very
But
true.
but having said that, I think this is a valuable thing for a viewer, because basically, unless they understand these things, they could be buying, as we used to call it, a pig in a poke, right? Oh my God, you just, and for restaurants, it's not 80%, it's like 90% in the first
Yeah,
5 years.
yeah, it's worse. Yeah, it's worse.
Well, there's also two ways of buying a business. You can buy the stock of the company that's selling the business, or you could buy assets. People that are buying businesses want to buy assets. Why? Because if you buy the stock of the company, if something happened 5 years ago and there's a lawsuit against that company, guess who picks up the bill?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
So
If I
another
can use an
thing,
example for
it
that,
gets
I think
very complicated.
yeah.
uh, I was working for a window company back in 2005, 2006. And one of the issues for their buyer was all these windows that had been sold for these new complexes. What if there was a suit against them? And they were really reluctant to buy, because basically, as you were just pointing out, Ed, it could be they could lose all their business if a lawsuit came out against that particular product.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can give you another example. Red Fusion had a particular client that was a roofing company, and 3, 4 years in, they came back and said, "We'd like a new website." Well, what's wrong with the old one? I mean, you spent money on it, and they said, "Well, we're changing the company." Well, what are you talking about? He said, "Every 5 years we close down."
Yeah.
And we start over again. And so we get rid of the name, we get rid of the thing, we find a new office, we change personnel, a little bit of personnel, we change the rotation of our officers. And that's like, wow, that's an unusual strategy.
That's kind of scary.
But he said, you accumulate so much labor liability from being sued. He didn't have any problem about the quality of the roof that he did. It was a good roof, and it wasn't like the roofs were bad and there was going to be a class action suit. But it was labor law issues. So, he's in California, and as you've heard before, California has very, very strict labor laws. It's very easy to get sued by labor because you miscounted the number of minutes that they worked. Or you did something else time-wise, and they're very, very strict. It's very, very costly. They understood this because they'd been sued enough, and they realized that they had to clean the slate every 5 years in order to stay in business, because they knew that sooner or later, the longer the business was there, the more chance of a class action suit would
Right,
increase.
right.
Yeah.
And every 5 years they would have deeper pockets besides.
Yeah. So they'd take money out,
Yeah.
they'd put it away, salt it away someplace where, the lawyers couldn't get it. And then they'd start another business, and it'd be small, and they'd build back up, and but they weren't going to leave the money in the business so that some attorney would come along and say, how much are you worth? We'll take all of that.
Yeah.
Which has happened to a client of ours recently, as we know. It does happen.
No, it does. And I think, I'll just, as an aside, we need tort reform in the worst way.
Ooh,
But it's
absolutely.
really hard because the attorneys run the whole system, so they're not willing to do that.
Well, and you talk about inflation, I don't have any idea. That's our number one problem today. How much inflation is created due to overregulation and a sue-happy legal society? I think tort reform would do a lot to get rid of inflation.
Yeah.
I'm not completely, just, but a
Yeah,
portion.
yeah.
A portion of the cost of everything goes to risk management in a variety of ways.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be that risky. That's a legal issue.
Right, right.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time going over programs, how we try to increase the value of a business. But there's got to be an equal amount of focus on asset protection. And because when you're operating in the state, as Ron indicated, especially California, you could lose everything over one problem, one issue.
Yeah.
And you got to think about asset protection. And there are companies out there that focus on tax strategies and asset protection. And I'm going through that with one of my clients right now, and it really does make a lot of sense. We're going to set up another company that's going to have all the assets, and they're going to lease the assets back to the company.
Yeah.
For asset protection.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a big issue.
Right.
The last issue is due diligence. When you develop a purchase agreement to buy the business, you want to go through and make sure you've checked everything out. Everything is according to what you think it is, and pay special attention to the lease agreements. I'm aware of a hardware store right now that has made a lot of money, is very profitable, but their lease is expiring and they're going to raise the rent by 50%.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden they don't know what to do because they can't operate there any longer. And that's where a lot of the goodwill is for that location.
Right. Yeah, we have another client that both you and I are familiar with that had the same situation.
Yes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I don't think a lot of people focus on these types of opportunities, but they're out there. And I think it's something you should be aware of and be looking all the time, because you never know. And that pretty much concludes the presentation.
No, you did a great job, I think, and it was a good conversation as well, because anybody who might be listening or watching, they certainly would benefit from having our combined years of experience in some of the pitfalls that we've seen our clients run into, including our own. So,
Well, Ron and I just talked to somebody a month ago, and they wanted to expand their business and they wanted to buy something, and somebody had to sell, and in reality they were going to end up paying more money than they should because they're trying to be nice, and and then they're expanding their business into an area that they don't have any expertise, so they don't have the management to do so, and they're relying upon an outside person to handle everything. That's a disaster for failure, if you ask me. But at least the gentleman asked for an opinion, which I think is very healthy.
Yeah.
well, the question is, did he exercise your input, or did he go
No,
ahead?
I think he was pretty much sold he was going to do what he was going to do.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think what this really illustrates is we're talking about how to buy a business, and really what we also did is come up with all the reasons you shouldn't buy one. And I don't think that was the purpose at all. I think the purpose is due diligence, just to take that term and throw it against every single one of these slides.
Yeah.
Really is what is required in order to lower your risk and hope that you can really make your investment turn into something that has a real return on investment, and you can really make it happen. There are definite advantages to buying a business. I think we've talked about some of them, but getting a ready pool of assets is, for low cost is one of them, and a business that already has systems in place and a functioning, say, order system and production system and software in place. Those are all assets that are good things for a business. And of course, having a stream of cash flow is very important, and Ed covered all of that. There are good reasons for buying a business.
Yes.
And I hope that we would leave our viewers with the attitude that, okay, I will leave myself open and look for business, and I'll also look to mitigate any risk that I can identify in order to make this thing work. You got to do the best you can in order to be able to, create advantages that will give you sort of an even chance at making it work. You don't want to give away too much. You don't want to pay too much, because chances are it's not worth that much anyway. So
Yeah, and I think if I can add this, and you didn't say this, Ron, your own expertise. You got to have sales and marketing systems and see if they work and if they're consistent, before you buy a company and you find out the systems don't work. You can have great operations, but if you don't have the sales coming in, you don't have a way of marketing it.
yeah. Well, that's a really good point. I'll just elaborate just to touch on that, and that is that one of the things that that I would do is to look at a business where I would completely rethink the marketing positioning. In other words, somebody is a high-end manufacturer of some good, and they're known for high quality and very high prices. And maybe with the economy the way it's going to go here, maybe that's not positioned well with the group of customers that they have right now. Maybe it is, but it might also be that to maintain that high quality and figure out a way to lower the prices might remarket it as a value product instead of a high-end, say, luxury product. You can take a luxury product and bring it down. You can almost never take a medium priced, medium quality product and bring it up. People will never trust you. So the brand itself has a lot to say about how you might refashion that business and whether or not it's going to work with what you want to do, and where you see your market niche. But having the mechanics of a business and then simply refashioning it to a new market niche, that's not a bad strategy either.
Right. In fact, it's funny you should bring that up. If you recall, back in the late 60s, a lot of the cars were setting up, trying to go luxury with a Chevy, so you had a Caprice and you had a Ford LTD, and all they had is little stickers on them that said, I'm a limited, or they had a little port window or whatever. But it was, to your point, Ron, it was trying to move into the luxury niche without actually having to spend luxury money to be able to get it. So people bought them, lots of them.
Yeah, well, yeah, that did happen, and then of course there was that time in the 70s where it was just the label and there was hardly any difference, and eventually the consumer figured out that it was just the label, and they began to buy European cars because they had realized that the wool had been pulled over their eyes on branding. And even Cadillac went through that to some extent. They've done a good job bringing back that label again.
Yes.
Cadillac has done a good job. So now they're sort of back in there with, foreign luxury cars, I would say. But so many of the cars that came out, the X cars and all, they just absolutely missed the mark and failed. And they only got that little short period of time.
Right.
When they were able to pretend like they're a luxury and deliver the same old tin can,
Yeah.
Consumers eventually catch up with you. They
That's right. Yeah. It was an interesting analogy to what we're trying to say is that, it's another way to reposition your business to take advantage of something, in the market that's looking for a cheap way to look better.
Yeah. Well, right. And there are also skills. We might throw that out. There are skills in some companies that you don't have in yours. If you had a product that would somehow do better because you had laser etching on it or something, but you didn't have anybody who knew how to do it, and the new company did that all the time. I mean, if you could add that to your product mix, and bring it in, that would be another good way to sort of refocus, reposition your company with the assets of another company. The skills are assets, and that's important. And the people who have those skills, as we're talking about offline, buying the people today may be as important of a strategy as anything else.
Exactly. And the flip side of what you're talking about is that if you buy the business and a key employee leaves, what do you have?
Not much.
Don't have a lot.
That's right. Yeah.
So this is a great show. Thank you,
Good
Ed,
program.
for helping us through. So again, we look forward to having you guys join us again in another week. It's always a lot of fun to sit here and have conversation about what it takes to either buy, sell, or run a business. Thanks again, guys.